My name is Chen, and I'm 22 years old. When I walked into what used to be my childhood bedroom after 6 months of basic training, I found gaming equipment, sports trophies, and another person's entire life where mine should have been. The betrayal cut deeper than any drill sergeant's criticism ever could. But what I discovered hidden in my stepbrother's new desk drawer would reveal a conspiracy that had been brewing since the day I left for the military. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in Sacramento, California, I had always been the kind of person who needed my own space to think and recharge. My bedroom on the second floor of our modest two-story house wasn't large, but it was mine. The walls were painted a soft lavender that I had chosen when I turned 16, and every corner held memories of the girl I had been. Band posters from my high school marching band days covered one wall, while my bookshelf overflowed with fantasy novels and military history books that had sparked my interest in serving my country. My father, Chen, had raised me alone since my mother passed away from cancer when I was 12. Those years of just the two of us had forged a bond I thought was unbreakable. He worked as a supervisor at a local manufacturing plant, often pulling double shifts to ensure I had everything I needed. We had our traditions, like Saturday morning pancakes that he would flip too high just to make me laugh, and Sunday afternoon hikes in the nearby foothills where we would talk about everything and nothing. When I was 19, Dad met Sandra Walsh at a company picnic. She was recently divorced with a 15-year-old son named Blake, and she worked in the accounting department of the same manufacturing company. Sandra was attractive in an understated way, with auburn hair always pulled back in a practical ponytail and a smile that seemed genuine enough. She made Dad laugh in a way I hadn't heard since before Mom died, and I was genuinely happy for him. Blake was the kind of teenager who seemed to coast through life on natural athletic ability and social confidence. He played varsity football, despite being relatively small for the position, and he had a way of charming adults that made teachers overlook his mediocre grades. When I first met him, he was polite but distant, clearly more interested in his phone than in getting to know his potential stepsister. The relationship between Dad and Sandra progressed quickly. Within 8 months, she and Blake had moved into our house, and Sandra's presence began changing the dynamics I had known my entire life. She rearranged the kitchen to be more efficient, replaced our old mismatched furniture with coordinated pieces from discount stores, and gradually introduced new rules about chores and curfews that applied mainly to me since Blake somehow always had legitimate excuses. I tried to be welcoming and understanding. I knew Dad deserved happiness after years of loneliness, and Sandra genuinely seemed to care about him. She cooked elaborate dinners that were far more sophisticated than our usual rotation of takeout and frozen meals, and she encouraged Dad to take better care of his health and appearance. In many ways, she was good for him. Blake and I maintained a cordial but superficial relationship. We shared the upstairs bathroom without major conflicts, though I quickly learned to keep my personal items in my room after some of my more expensive skincare products mysteriously disappeared. He was loud and messy in the way teenage boys often are, but he stayed mostly in his new room at the end of the hall, and I stayed in mine. The wedding happened 6 months later in a small ceremony at a local garden venue. I wore a dusty rose bridesmaid dress that Sandra had chosen, and I genuinely smiled as I watched Dad promise to love and honor his new wife. Blake served as a groomsman, looking uncomfortable in his rented tuxedo, but managing to behave appropriately throughout the ceremony. During the reception, as I watched my new stepfamily mingling with our extended relatives and family friends, I felt a mixture of hope and apprehension about our future together. Change was never easy, but I was determined to make this blended family work for Dad's sake. The first real signs of trouble emerged gradually over the following year. Sandra had strong opinions about how a household should be run, and many of her suggestions seemed designed to give Blake advantages while creating additional responsibilities for me. She instituted a new chore schedule that assigned me most of the deep cleaning tasks while Blake was responsible for lighter duties like taking out trash and mowing the lawn occasionally. When I pointed out the imbalance to Dad, Sandra was quick with explanations about Blake's demanding football schedule and his need to focus on improving his grades for college applications. Dad, eager to maintain harmony in his new marriage, generally sided with Sandra's reasoning, though I could sometimes see doubt flickering in his eyes. Blake's behavior toward me became increasingly territorial as he grew more comfortable in the house. He would use my bathroom when his was perfectly available, leaving wet towels on the floor and using up all the hot water before my morning showers. When I complained, Sandra would remind me that sharing was part of being a family, and that I needed to be more flexible and understanding of Blake's needs as a growing teenage boy. More troubling were the small violations of my personal space that began occurring regularly. Items would be moved in my room when I returned from classes at the local community college, where I was completing my general education requirements before transferring to a 4-year university. Nothing was ever missing, but my books would be rearranged, my desk chair would be adjusted to a different height, and once I found Blake's distinctive cologne lingering in the air when I came home from work. When I mentioned these incidents to Dad, he suggested I might be imagining things or that maybe Sandra had been cleaning my room as a nice gesture. But Sandra never cleaned my room, and she certainly never wore masculine cologne. The gaslighting was subtle but consistent, and I began to feel like I was losing my grip on reality within my own home. The decision to join the military crystallized during my 2nd year of community college. I had always been fascinated by military history and had tremendous respect for service members, but the final push came from my deteriorating home situation and my desire to serve my country while gaining valuable skills and education benefits. I researched different branches extensively before deciding on the Army, drawn to their strong educational programs and opportunities for advancement in fields that interested me. The decision to enlist wasn't made lightly, and I spent weeks discussing it with Dad, who was initially concerned about the dangers but ultimately supportive of my choice. Sandra's reaction was more complex. She expressed worry about my safety, which seemed genuine, but there was also something that felt like relief in her response. She made comments about how the structure and discipline would be good for me, as if I had been lacking those qualities at home. Blake's reaction was typically dismissive. He made jokes about me becoming a soldier and asked if I was sure I was tough enough for military life. The months leading up to my departure for basic training were filled with preparation, paperwork, and increasingly frequent conflicts at home. Blake's behavior became more brazenly disrespectful, as if he sensed that my time in the house was limited and he could accelerate his claim to territory. He began using my bathroom exclusively, claiming his shower wasn't working properly, though I never saw anyone attempt to repair it. More concerning were the times I would find him in my room when I came home unexpectedly. He always had an excuse about looking for something, or Sandra.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Asking him to retrieve an item. But his explanations never quite made sense. When I started locking my bedroom door, Sandra made a comment about how secretive I had become and suggested that locked doors weren't necessary in a family home. Dad seemed increasingly caught between loyalty to me and his desire to maintain peace with his new wife. Our Saturday morning pancake tradition had ended months earlier, replaced by Sandra's preference for elaborate weekend brunches that required extensive preparation and cleanup. Our hiking talks became infrequent, then stopped altogether as Sandra planned family activities that somehow never quite accommodated my work and school schedule. 3 weeks before I left for basic training, I had a conversation with Dad that I hoped would clear the air about my concerns. We were in the garage where he was organizing tools, and I finally voiced my fears about Blake's behavior and Sandra's apparent favoritism. Dad listened quietly as I explained the bathroom situation, the intrusions into my room, and my feeling that I was being pushed out of my own home. His response was measured but disappointing. He acknowledged that blending families was challenging, and suggested that once I returned from basic training, we could revisit household arrangements if necessary. What struck me most was his phrasing. He talked about my return as if it were uncertain, and he referred to household arrangements as if my bedroom and my place in the family were negotiable. The conversation left me feeling more unsettled than before, but I was so close to leaving that I decided to focus on my upcoming military service rather than family drama. My last week at home was a whirlwind of final preparations, goodbye dinners with friends, and emotional moments with Dad, as reality set in that I would be gone for months. Sandra organized a small farewell gathering with extended family, and everyone wished me well with genuine warmth and pride. Blake even managed to say something supportive about my decision to serve, though his comments felt rehearsed rather than heartfelt. The night before I left, Dad and I had a private conversation in the living room after Sandra and Blake had gone to bed. He told me how proud he was of my decision to serve, and how much he would miss me. He promised to take care of my room and my belongings, and he assured me that everything would be exactly as I left it when I returned. Looking back now, I realized there was something in his eyes that night that should have warned me. He seemed sad in a way that went beyond normal parental worry about a child leaving home. There was guilt there, and resignation, as if he already knew what was coming but felt powerless to prevent it. I hugged him tightly and told him I loved him, never imagining that this conversation would be the last time I felt completely secure in my relationship with my father. The trust and confidence I had in our bond, built over 22 years of shared experiences and mutual respect, was about to be shattered in ways I never could have anticipated. Basic training at Fort Moore in Georgia was exactly as challenging and transformative as I had expected. The physical demands pushed my body beyond limits I didn't know I had, while the mental challenges forced me to develop resilience and problem-solving skills that would serve me throughout my life. The drill sergeants were tough but fair, and I thrived under the structure and clear expectations that military life provided. The friendships I formed with my fellow trainees became a new kind of family, bonded by shared struggles and mutual support through the most difficult experience any of us had ever faced. We pushed each other to excel, celebrated small victories together, and provided comfort during moments of doubt and homesickness. Communication with home was limited during basic training, which was both a blessing and a source of anxiety. I was able to call Dad once a week for short conversations that barely scratched the surface of my experiences or my emotional state. He always sounded happy to hear from me, asking about my training and expressing pride in my progress, but there was a distance in his voice that I attributed to the stress of our separation. Sandra occasionally got on the phone to ask how I was doing, and her questions seemed caring enough, though she often steered the conversation toward practical matters like whether I needed anything sent or if I had questions about benefits and paperwork. Blake never asked to speak with me, which wasn't particularly surprising given our relationship, but Dad would usually mention that he said hello. About halfway through basic training, I began noticing subtle changes in Dad's tone during our weekly calls. He seemed more hurried and less willing to engage in longer conversations about my experiences. When I asked about home, his updates were brief and focused on work and weather, rather than the personal details that had always characterized our communication. I attributed these changes to the natural adjustment period that families experience when a member leaves for military service. I knew Dad was probably lonely and trying to navigate his new role as a husband and stepfather without my presence as a buffer. I assumed Sandra and Blake were also adjusting to my absence in their own ways. During my final month of basic training, I became increasingly excited about my upcoming leave and return home. I had earned commendations for marksmanship and leadership, and I was eager to share my accomplishments with Dad. I had also purchased small gifts for everyone during our brief authorized shopping trips, including a military-themed coffee mug for Dad, and books about military history that I thought Blake might find interesting. The anticipation of sleeping in my own bed, eating home-cooked meals, and reconnecting with Dad sustained me through the final grueling weeks of training. I fantasized about long conversations where I could process my experiences and share how much I had grown and changed during my time away. 2 weeks before graduation, I called home with news about my exact return date and flight information. Dad sounded pleased and promised to pick me up at the airport, but there was something strained in his voice that I couldn't quite identify. When I asked if everything was okay at home, he assured me that everything was fine and that everyone was looking forward to my return. Sandra got on the phone briefly to congratulate me on nearing graduation and to ask if I had any special requests for meals during my leave. Her questions seemed thoughtful, though there was an underlying tension that made me wonder if she and Dad had been arguing about something. When I asked to speak with Blake to tell him about the books I had bought, she said he was at football practice, but would be excited to hear from me. The final week of basic training passed in a blur of final evaluations, graduation preparations, and excitement about returning home. I had successfully completed one of the most challenging experiences of my life, and I felt stronger, more confident, and more mature than when I had left 6 months earlier. The graduation ceremony was emotional and inspiring, with families traveling from across the country to celebrate their loved ones' achievements. I was disappointed that Dad couldn't make the trip due to work commitments, but I understood that the expense and time off would have been difficult to manage. He promised to see all my photos and hear every detail when I got home. As I boarded the plane for my journey back to California, I was filled with anticipation and a deep sense of accomplishment. I had survived basic training, earned the respect of my drill sergeants and fellow soldiers, and proven to myself that I could handle whatever challenges life might present. I had no idea that the most difficult challenge was waiting for me at home, where my absence had created an opportunity for betrayal that would test everything I had learned about resilience, integrity, and standing up for what was right. The girl who had left for basic training 6 months earlier would never have been prepared for what I was about to discover, but the soldier returning home had been forged by experience into someone who would not back down from a fight, even when the battlefield was her own family. The flight from Georgia to Sacramento felt endless, despite my excitement to be going home. I stared out the window at the changing landscape below, thinking about how different I felt from the uncertain young woman who had made this journey in reverse 6 months ago. Basic training had given me confidence, discipline, and a clear sense of my own capabilities that I had never possessed before. I had written a long letter to Dad during my final week of training, trying to capture some of the transformation I had experienced and my gratitude for his support of my decision to serve. I planned to give it to him during one of our reconnection conversations, along with a detailed account of my training experiences and my excitement about my future military career. As the plane descended toward Sacramento, I felt a mixture of anticipation and nervousness that surprised me. 6 months wasn't an extraordinarily long time to be away, but it had been the longest separation Dad and I had ever experienced. I wondered how much things had changed at home and whether the family dynamics had improved or deteriorated in my absence. Dad was waiting at the gate with a smile that seemed genuine but somehow smaller than I remembered. He looked older, though that might have been my imagination, and there was a weariness around his eyes that hadn't been there before. When he hugged me, I noticed he seemed thinner, and his embrace felt less solid and reassuring than the countless hugs of my childhood. The drive home was filled with surface-level conversation about my flight, the weather, and general questions about basic training. I launched into stories about some of my experiences, but I noticed Dad seemed distracted and less engaged than I had expected. When I asked about Sandra and Blake, he gave brief, positive updates, but didn't elaborate with the kind of personal details that had always characterized our conversations. As we pulled into our driveway, I felt a surge of genuine happiness at seeing our house again. It looked exactly the same from the outside, with the same slightly overgrown front garden that Dad never quite managed to maintain properly, and the basketball hoop over the garage door that Blake had lobbied for and received shortly after moving in. Sandra greeted me at the front door with what seemed like genuine warmth, commenting on how healthy and fit I looked and asking about my journey home. She had prepared a welcome home dinner with several of my favorite dishes, and the gesture felt thoughtful and caring. Blake emerged from the living room where he had been watching television, offering a casual greeting and a quick acknowledgement of my return. The house felt both familiar and different in ways I couldn't immediately identify. The furniture was mostly the same, but there were subtle changes in decoration and arrangement that reflected Sandra's continued influence on our living space. Family photos had been rearranged to include more pictures of Blake's sports achievements, and some of my own photos from high school activities had been moved to less prominent positions. During dinner, the conversation flowed more naturally as everyone asked questions about basic training, and I shared some of the more humorous stories from my experiences. Sandra seemed genuinely interested in hearing about the other women in my unit and the challenges we had faced together. Blake asked a few questions about weapons training that suggested he had been thinking about military service himself, though he quickly changed the subject when Sandra gave him a sharp look. Dad appeared more relaxed as the evening progressed, and I began to feel like my earlier concerns about tension at home had been unnecessary worry. Families naturally go through adjustment periods, and 6 months was enough time for everyone to find new rhythms and routines. I was probably overthinking subtle changes that were completely normal. After dinner, I was eager to go to my room and unpack my belongings, shower in my own bathroom, and settle back into my personal space. The barracks at basic training had been functional but stark, and I was looking forward to being surrounded by my own possessions and decorations again. As I climbed the stairs toward my bedroom, chatting with Dad about my plans for the next few days of leave, I noticed that Blake's door was closed, but light was visible underneath. I could hear music playing softly, which wasn't unusual, though it seemed louder than what I remembered him typically playing. When I reached my bedroom door, I paused with my hand on the familiar doorknob, savoring the moment of return to my most personal space. 6 months of sharing living quarters with dozens of other women had made me deeply appreciate the luxury of privacy and personal territory. I turned the handle and pushed open the door, expecting to see my lavender walls, my bookshelf, my desk with its familiar clutter of personal items, and my bed with its worn but comfortable quilted comforter that had been mine since high school. Instead, I found myself staring at a room that had been completely transformed into a teenage boy's sanctuary. The walls had been repainted a dark blue, and posters of sports cars and bikini-clad women covered the surfaces where my band posters had once hung. A large gaming setup dominated one corner, with multiple monitors, speakers, and equipment that must have cost thousands of dollars. Blake's football trophies and awards covered my former bookshelf, and his clothes filled the closet where my uniforms and personal belongings should have been stored. The bed was larger than mine had been, with masculine bedding in navy and gray, and there were personal items scattered across every surface that made it clear this was not a temporary arrangement. I stood frozen in the doorway, trying to process what I was seeing. This wasn't my room anymore. This was Blake's room, completely and thoroughly, as if I had never lived here at all. Every trace of my presence had been erased and replaced with his possessions and preferences. My military training kicked in, and I remained calm outwardly while my mind raced to understand the situation. I called out for Dad in a voice that I managed to keep steady, though my heart was pounding with a mixture of shock, anger, and disbelief. Dad appeared at the top of the stairs within moments, and the expression on his face told me that he had been dreading this moment since I walked through the front door. Behind him, Sandra emerged from their bedroom, and I could hear Blake's door opening as well. Looking at Dad's guilty, defensive expression, I realized that this wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. This had been planned, discussed, and executed deliberately during my absence. My room, my personal space, my place in this family had been given away while I was serving my country, and everyone in the house except me had known it was happening. The betrayal cut deeper than anything I had experienced during the most difficult days of basic training. Drill sergeants might break you down to build you back up, but this was different. This was my own family, dismantling my place in our home while I was away, creating a situation where I would return to find myself displaced and unwelcome. Standing in the doorway of what used to be my sanctuary, surrounded by my father and step-family, I felt truly homeless for the first time in my life. The house where I had grown up, where my mother had lived and died, where I had assumed I would always belong, had been redistributed in my absence like I was a tenant whose lease had expired rather than a daughter returning from military service. The silence stretched uncomfortably as everyone waited for my reaction. I could see Dad steeling himself for an argument, Sandra preparing explanations and justifications, and Blake hovering uncertainly in his doorway, probably unsure whether to retreat or defend his new territory. But in that moment, I drew on the lessons I had learned about tactical assessment and strategic thinking. Before I reacted emotionally, I needed to understand the full scope of what had happened and what my options were for addressing this betrayal. The girl who had left for basic training might have collapsed in tears or exploded in anger. The soldier who had returned home was going to gather intelligence first and then formulate a plan of action. What I was about to discover would make the theft of my bedroom seem like a minor infraction compared to the deeper conspiracy that had been unfolding since the day I left for basic training. The first words that came out of my mouth surprised even me with their steady, measured tone. "Where are my belongings?" I asked, looking directly at Dad while Sandra shifted uncomfortably behind him and Blake remained frozen in his doorway. Dad's response came in a rush of words that sounded rehearsed, as if he had been practicing this explanation for weeks. "Riley, we can talk about this downstairs. Let's not make this more difficult than it needs to be. We've made some adjustments while you were away, and we can work out new arrangements now that you're back." The word adjustments hit me like a physical blow. My entire life had been reduced to an adjustment, something that could be modified or relocated based on the convenience of others. I stepped fully into what had been my room, taking in details I had missed in my initial shock. Blake's gaming chair sat exactly where my desk chair used to be, positioned to take advantage of the window light that I had always loved for reading. His expensive gaming headset hung on a hook where my collection of vintage band t-shirts used to be displayed. Even the outlet configuration had been changed, with power strips and cable management systems installed to support his electronic setup. "This isn't an adjustment," I said, my voice still controlled but with an edge that made Sandra take a step backward. "This is a complete replacement. Where are my things?" Sandra finally spoke up, her voice taking on the overly reasonable tone she used when she was about to deliver bad news disguised as logic. "Riley, honey, we know this is a shock, but we had to make some practical decisions. Blake needed a larger room for his equipment and his growth as a teenager. Your room was just sitting empty for months." The phrase, "just sitting empty," revealed so much about how my absence had been viewed. My room hadn't been waiting for my return, like a preserved space for a family member serving overseas. It had been seen as wasted real estate, available for redistribution to someone whose needs were considered more important than mine. "I was serving my country," I said, turning to face Sandra directly. "Not abandoning my home. I explicitly discussed maintaining my room with Dad before I left." Dad's face flushed red, and I could see the guilt and defensiveness warring in his expression. "We didn't make this decision lightly, Riley." Blake was struggling with the smaller room, and his therapist suggested that having more space might help with his adjustment issues. This was the first I had heard about Blake having adjustment issues or seeing a therapist. During our weekly phone calls, Dad had never mentioned any problems or concerns about Blake's well-being. In fact, the few updates I had received suggested that Blake was thriving with his football season and improved grades. "What adjustment issues?" I asked, genuinely confused. "And when did Blake start seeing a therapist?" Sandra and Dad exchanged a look that made it clear they had hoped to avoid this particular conversation. Blake himself looked uncomfortable, shifting from foot to foot in his doorway like he wanted to disappear entirely. "Blake has been having some difficulty with the transition to military family life," Sandra explained, her voice taking on a protective mother tone. "The uncertainty about deployments and the changes in household dynamics were causing him anxiety. Dr. Martinez suggested that having a stable, comfortable personal space would help him feel more secure." The manipulation in this explanation was breathtaking. Blake's supposed anxiety about military family life was being used to justify taking away the room of the actual military family member. My service, which should have been a source of pride and respect, was being framed as a destabilizing force that required accommodation through the sacrifice of my personal space. "Where are my belongings?" I asked again, refusing to be drawn into debates about Blake's therapeutic needs or the family dynamics created by my service. Dad gestured vaguely toward the hallway. "We've stored everything safely. It's all in the basement and the garage. Nothing was thrown away or damaged." The basement. My childhood possessions, my books, my personal mementos, my furniture, everything that had made that room mine for over a decade, had been relegated to storage in damp, unfinished spaces, like seasonal decorations or outgrown sporting equipment. I walked past all of them and headed downstairs, needing to see the extent of the situation for myself. Behind me, I could hear Sandra whispering urgently to Dad and Blake's door, finally closing with a soft click. The basement was partially finished with concrete floors and exposed ceiling beams, used primarily for laundry and storage. In one corner, I found my belongings stacked in cardboard boxes with hasty labels written in Sandra's handwriting. Riley's books, Riley's desk items, Riley's decorations. My furniture, including my desk, my bookshelf, and my dresser, had been pushed against the far wall and covered with old sheets. My mattress and bed frame were leaning against the concrete wall, wrapped in plastic but clearly having suffered from months in the damp environment. As I pulled back one of the sheets, I discovered that my wooden desk had developed water stains and warping from the basement humidity. My bookshelf showed similar damage, with some of the finish bubbling and peeling. These weren't just storage inconveniences. They were permanent damage to furniture that held sentimental value and represented years of my life. In the garage, I found more boxes containing my clothes, shoes, and personal electronics. Everything had been packed hurriedly, with little attention to protecting delicate items or organizing things in a way that would make retrieval easy. Some boxes had gotten wet during winter storms, and I could see water damage on several items that peeked through the cardboard. The scope of the betrayal was becoming clearer. This hadn't been a sudden decision made in response to an unexpected opportunity. The systematic packing, labeling, and storage of my possessions indicated planning and preparation that had taken considerable time and effort. Dad appeared at the garage entrance as I was examining a box of water-damaged photo albums from my high school years. "Riley, I know this looks bad, but we can fix this. We can set up a nice space for you in the basement. Sandra has some ideas about how to make it comfortable." The suggestion that I should accept a basement bedroom in my own childhood home while my stepbrother enjoyed the premium space I had always occupied was so insulting that I had to take several deep breaths before responding. "Dad," I said quietly, "I need you to think very carefully about what you're suggesting. You want your daughter, who just completed military basic training in service to her country, to live in the basement while your stepson enjoys the bedroom I've had since I was 10 years old." Dad's face crumpled slightly, and for a moment, I saw a flash of the man who had raised me with love and respect for over 2 decades. But it was quickly replaced by the defensive expression of someone who had made a decision he knew was wrong but was too invested to reverse. Blake needed the space for his equipment and his therapy process. The basement can be really nice with some work. Sandra has found some great decorating ideas online. The fact that Sandra had been researching basement bedroom decorations revealed that this conversation had been anticipated and planned for. They had known I would be upset, and they had prepared responses and alternatives designed to make me accept the unacceptable. I climbed the stairs back to the main floor, leaving Dad standing among the boxes of my displaced life. In the kitchen, Sandra was making coffee with nervous energy, arranging and rearranging items on the counter while glancing frequently toward the hallway. "Riley," she said as I entered, "I know this is a difficult adjustment, but I really think once you see the possibilities for the basement space, you'll be excited about the privacy and independence it could offer." The word independence was particularly galling. True independence would have been returning to find my room exactly as I had left it, with my possessions safe and my place in the family secure. This forced relocation was the opposite of independence. It was displacement disguised as opportunity. "Sandra," I said, keeping my voice level, "I need to understand the timeline of this decision. When exactly did you and Dad decide to move Blake into my room?" Her hands stilled on the coffee cups, and I could see her calculating how much truth she wanted to reveal. "It evolved gradually," she said finally. "Blake was struggling, and Dr. Martinez made the suggestion about space. We discussed it with your father, and he agreed it was best for the family overall." "When did these discussions happen?" I pressed. "It wasn't one conversation," she hedged. "It was a process that developed over several months." Several months. They had been planning to displace me for most of the time I was away at basic training. While I was pushing myself through the most challenging experience of my life, calling home each week with updates and expressions of love and homesickness, my own family was systematically erasing my presence from our home. "Did Dad ever consider discussing this with me during our weekly calls?" I asked. Sandra's expression became defensive. "We didn't want to distract you from your important training. Military service requires complete focus, and we thought it would be better to handle family logistics without adding stress to your experience." The paternalistic condescension in this explanation was stunning. My family had made a major decision about my living situation without my input, using my military service as justification for excluding me from discussions that directly affected my life. Blake appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking uncomfortable but trying to project casual normalcy. "Hey Riley, I just wanted to say thanks for the books you sent. They look really interesting." His attempt to normalize the situation by referencing the gifts I had sent him was either remarkably insensitive or deliberately provocative. I had purchased those books while thinking fondly of my little stepbrother, and hoping to share my interest in military history with him. "Where are the books now?" I asked. "They're in my room," he said, then seemed to realize the implications of his words. "I mean, they're upstairs, on the bookshelf." My bookshelf. In my room, where my things belonged but were no longer welcome. "Blake," I said carefully, "how do you feel about this situation?" He glanced quickly at his mother before answering. I mean, it's working out really well. The space is great for my gaming setup, and I've been getting better grades since I moved in. The practice nature of his response suggested that this answer had been coached. He was reciting benefits that aligned with Sandra's justifications, rather than expressing genuine feelings about displacing his stepsister. "Did you ask for my room specifically, or was it offered to you?" I asked. Another glance at Sandra. It just made sense with the layouts and everything. Mom and Dad thought it would work better for everyone. The evasion in his answer told me what I needed to know. Blake hadn't advocated for taking my room. He had been the beneficiary of a decision made by the adults in his life. That didn't absolve him of responsibility for accepting benefits he knew came at my expense. But it clarified where the primary blame belonged. Dad rejoined us in the V4 kitchen, looking haggard and defensive. "Riley, we need to find a way to move forward constructively. What's done is done. And we can't change it now. Blake has settled into the room, and disrupting that would be harmful to his therapeutic progress." The suggestion that reversing their betrayal would be harmful to Blake, while the original betrayal was apparently harmless to me, revealed the fundamental bias that had driven this entire situation. Blake's comfort and preferences had been prioritized over my rights and dignity as a family member and military service member. "Dad," I said, "I need you to hear what you're saying. You're telling me that fixing the wrong you did to me would be harmful to the person who benefited from that wrong. You're asking me to accept permanent displacement to protect Blake from the consequences of a decision he didn't make but certainly enjoyed." Dad's jaw tightened. "This isn't about right and wrong, Riley. It's about what works best for the family as a whole. Blake is at a crucial point in his development, and stability is important for teenagers." "What about stability for me?" I asked. "What about the stability of coming home from military service to find that my place in this family was secure and valued?" Sandra interjected with her most reasonable voice. "Riley, you're an adult now. You're building an independent life through your military career. Blake is still a child who needs our support and guidance." The implication that military service had somehow aged me out of deserving a place in my childhood home was breathtakingly callous. My willingness to serve my country was being used as evidence that I no longer needed or deserved the same consideration as my stepbrother. "I'm 22 years old," I said. "Blake is 17. The age difference doesn't justify what you've done." "Blake is still in high school," Sandra continued. "He needs consistency and support during these formative years. You have your military training and your future career to provide structure and purpose." The suggestion that my military service was somehow a substitute for family belonging revealed how fundamentally they misunderstood both my service and my relationship to this family. Military training didn't eliminate my need for a home and family. It made those connections more precious and important. "I'm going for a walk," I said, needing space to process the situation and plan my response. "When I come back, I want to continue this conversation with specific timelines and details about how this decision was made." As I headed toward the front door, Sandra called after me. "Riley, we understand you're upset, but we hope you can approach this with maturity and consideration for everyone involved." The request for maturity from someone who had participated in displacing me while I was serving overseas was rich with irony, but I didn't respond. I needed fresh air and time to think clearly about my options and my next steps. The neighborhood looked the same as always, with familiar houses and gardens that had provided the backdrop for my childhood. But everything felt different now, viewed through the lens of betrayal and displacement. This was no longer simply the place where I had grown up. It was a community where my own family had decided I no longer belonged. As I walked the streets where I had learned to ride a bike, delivered newspapers, and said goodbye to friends before leaving for basic training, I found myself analyzing the situation with the tactical thinking that military training had instilled in me. The immediate problem was clear. My family had betrayed my trust and displaced me from my home while I was serving my country. But the deeper problem was more complex. This betrayal revealed fundamental attitudes about my value, my rights, and my place in the family that had probably existed long before this specific incident. Sandra's influence had gradually shifted family dynamics in ways that prioritized Blake's needs and preferences over mine. Dad's willingness to go along with this shift revealed either weakness in standing up for me or agreement with the underlying priorities that made my displacement acceptable. The question now was how to respond in a way that protected my dignity, addressed the injustice, and potentially salvaged whatever could be saved of my relationship with Dad. Military training had taught me that emotional reactions, while understandable, were less effective than strategic thinking and clear communication of non-negotiable positions. By the time I completed my circuit of the neighborhood and returned to the house, I had formulated a plan of action. I would gather more information about the timeline and decision-making process, document the damage to my belongings, and present Dad with clear options for addressing the situation. If he was willing to acknowledge the wrongness of what had happened and take concrete steps to fix it, we might be able to rebuild our relationship. If he continued to prioritize Blake's comfort over justice and respect for me, I would need to consider more drastic measures to protect my dignity and future. As I approached the front door, I could hear voices in the kitchen engaged in what sounded like an intense discussion. I paused on the front porch, not to eavesdrop but to prepare myself for the next phase of this confrontation. The girl who had left for basic training 6 months ago would have been devastated by this betrayal and might have accepted whatever arrangements the adults in her life deemed appropriate. The soldier returning home had been forged by challenges that made family manipulation seem manageable by comparison. I was no longer willing to accept mistreatment for the sake of family harmony. I had learned my own worth through military service, and I was prepared to defend it even against people who should have been protecting it themselves. The conversation I was about to have would determine whether this family could be repaired or whether some betrayals were too fundamental to overcome. Either way, I was done being the person who sacrificed her own dignity to make other people comfortable with their poor choices. When I walked back into the kitchen, the conversation stopped abruptly. Dad, Sandra, and Blake were seated around the kitchen table with coffee cups and serious expressions, clearly having used my absence to coordinate their approach to managing my reaction. "We've been discussing the situation," Dad said carefully, "and we want to find a solution that works for everyone." "I'm interested to hear what you've come up with," I replied, taking a seat at the table but maintaining a formal distance that reflected the shift in our relationship dynamics. Sandra leaned forward with her most earnest expression. "We think the basement could be transformed into a really wonderful space. Blake has offered to help with the renovation, and we could make it into something much nicer than a traditional bedroom." The offer of Blake's help with renovating my consolation prize living space was either tone-deaf or deliberately insulting. The idea that he would participate in creating my basement accommodation after enjoying the benefits of displacing me revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of the situation. "That's not a solution," I said firmly. "That's an attempt to make me accept an unacceptable situation by dressing it up as an opportunity." Dad's expression hardened. "Riley, we're trying to work with you here. We can't just uproot Blake's entire life because you're unhappy with the arrangements we made." The framing of potential justice as uprooting Blake's entire life, while my actual uprooting was treated as a minor inconvenience, revealed the deep bias that had driven this entire situation. "Dad," I said, "Blake's life isn't being uprooted by returning him to his original bedroom. His life was enhanced by uprooting mine. There's a significant difference." Sandra's voice took on an edge of impatience. "Riley, Blake has been settled in that room for 4 months now. His gaming equipment is set up, his furniture is arranged, and his therapeutic progress is connected to that stability. Moving him now would be disruptive and potentially harmful." "Moving me was disruptive and harmful," I pointed out. "But that didn't factor into your decision-making process." Blake finally spoke up, looking uncomfortable but trying to project reasonableness. "I mean, I could help you make the basement really cool. We could put in better lighting and maybe get a mini fridge or something." His offer to help improve my consolation prize with amenities revealed how completely he had accepted the narrative that my displacement was reasonable and that minor compensations could address the fundamental injustice. "Blake," I said, "do you understand why this situation is wrong?" He looked confused by the question. "I mean, it's not ideal, but everyone's trying to make it work." "Is it wrong for someone to give away your bedroom while you're not here to defend it?" I asked. "Well, yeah," he said slowly, "but this is different because it was for therapy reasons and family logistics." The coached language in his response revealed how thoroughly Sandra had shaped his understanding of the situation. He genuinely believed that therapeutic justifications and family logistics made my displacement acceptable in a way that his displacement would not be. What if I had therapeutic reasons for needing my room back? I asked. What if my military service had created mental health needs that required the stability and security of my original personal space? The question clearly hadn't occurred to any of them. The assumption that Blake's mental health needs were valid and important, while mine were irrelevant or non-existent, revealed another layer of bias in their decision-making. Dad shifted uncomfortably. Riley, if you're having mental health issues, we can get you help. But that doesn't mean we need to disrupt Blake's treatment progress. The suggestion that my potential mental health needs could be addressed through external help, while Blake's required accommodation through my displacement, was breathtakingly hypocritical. I'm not having mental health issues, I clarified. I'm having respect and dignity issues. I'm having family belonging issues. I'm having trust and betrayal issues. Sandra's expression became defensive. We never intended for you to feel betrayed. We were trying to manage a complex family situation in the best way possible. Whose input did you seek when making this decision? I asked. We consulted with Dr. Martinez about Blake's needs, Sandra replied. Did you consult with anyone about my needs or rights? The silence that followed answered my question completely. Did you discuss the ethics of displacing a military service member without her knowledge or consent? More silence. Did you consider the legal implications of disposing of someone's personal property and living space while they were deployed? Dad's face reddened. This isn't a legal matter, Riley. This is a family decision. Actually, Dad, when you relocate someone's belongings without permission and cause property damage through improper storage, it can absolutely become a legal matter. The mention of legal implications clearly made everyone uncomfortable, which told me they had never considered the potential consequences of their actions beyond managing my emotional reaction. What exactly are you threatening? Sandra asked, her voice taking on a cold edge. I'm not threatening anything, I replied calmly. I'm clarifying that actions have consequences, and that family relationships don't exempt people from responsibility for those consequences. Dad leaned back in his chair, looking older and more tired than I had ever seen him. What do you want from us, Riley? What would it take to resolve this situation? The question revealed that he still didn't understand the fundamental nature of what had been broken. He was looking for a transaction or compromise that could restore family harmony without addressing the underlying disrespect and betrayal. I want my room back, I said simply. I want my belongings returned to their proper place. I want acknowledgement that this decision was wrong and unfair. And I want assurance that major decisions affecting my life will include my input going forward. Blake can't just move out overnight, Sandra protested. His equipment is set up, his therapy routine is established, and the school year is in progress. Blake managed to move into my room while I was gone, I pointed out. If he could manage that transition for his benefit, he can manage the reverse transition to correct an injustice. It's not that simple, Dad said. Blake's mental health is involved now. My mental health was involved 6 months ago, but that didn't slow down your decision-making process. The conversation was revealing the fundamental problem. My family viewed Blake's comfort and preferences as legitimate factors requiring accommodation, while mine were treated as obstacles to be managed or overcome. What if we compromised? Sandra suggested. Blake could keep the room but share some of the space? Maybe set up a sleeping area for you when you're on leave? The suggestion that I should become a guest in my own childhood bedroom, sharing space with the person who had displaced me, was so insulting that I had to pause before responding. Sandra, I said carefully, would you accept that arrangement if someone gave away your bedroom and then offered to let you share it sometimes? She didn't answer, but her expression made it clear she understood the absurdity of her suggestion. I think we should take a break from this conversation, Dad said. Everyone's emotions are running high, and we might make more progress after we've all had time to think. Dad, I said, this isn't an emotional overreaction that will fade with time. This is a fundamental breach of trust and respect that requires concrete action to address. As I stood up from the table, I delivered the boundary I had decided on during my walk. I'm going to stay at a hotel tonight to give everyone time to process this situation. Tomorrow, I'd like to continue this conversation with specific proposals for how to fix what's been broken. You don't need to stay at a hotel, Dad said quickly. We can work something out for tonight. I'm not willing to sleep in the basement or on a couch in what used to be my own home, I replied. I'll be back tomorrow afternoon to hear your plan for addressing this situation. As I gathered my military duffel bag and prepared to leave, Sandra made one final attempt at emotional manipulation. Riley, we're family. Families work through difficult situations together. Walking away doesn't solve anything. Sandra, I said, family members don't displace each other while they're serving overseas. Walking away is a response to betrayal, not a cause of it. The drive to a nearby hotel gave me time to process the full scope of what had been revealed. The bedroom situation was just the visible symptom of a deeper problem. My family had fundamentally shifted their priorities and loyalties during my absence, and I was no longer considered a full member with equal rights and consideration. This wasn't a problem that could be solved with compromise or accommodation. It required either complete restoration of my rights and dignity, or acknowledgement that the family I had grown up in no longer existed in any form I could accept. As I checked into a modest hotel room and prepared for what might be my last night as a member of the Chen family, I felt a strange mixture of grief and relief. Grief for the loss of the relationship I had believed I had with Dad, and relief that my military training had given me the strength and independence to refuse unacceptable treatment. Tomorrow would bring either justice or a final break with the people who should have protected my place in our family but chose instead to trade it away for the comfort of others. Either outcome would be better than accepting a diminished role in my own life for the sake of preserving relationships that had already been fundamentally damaged by betrayal. The hotel room was Spartan but clean, with beige walls and generic artwork that reminded me of the temporary quarters I had grown accustomed to during military training. I sat on the edge of the bed with my laptop open, documenting everything that happened since my return home. Military training had taught me the importance of maintaining detailed records, especially when dealing with situations that might require formal action. I photographed the water damage to my furniture, cataloged the items that had been stored improperly, and created a timeline of events based on what I had learned during the confrontation. The evidence painted a clear picture of deliberate planning and systematic displacement that had begun within weeks of my departure for basic training. My phone buzzed with a text message from Dad. Riley, please come home, we can work this out as a family. The message revealed how completely he misunderstood the situation. This wasn't a family disagreement that could be resolved through discussion and compromise. This was a fundamental breach of trust that required acknowledgement and concrete action to address. I typed back a simple response. I'll return tomorrow at 2 p.m. to hear your plan for fixing this situation. That means my room, my belongings restored, and acknowledgement of wrongdoing. The response came quickly. That's not realistic. Blake's situation is complicated. I turned off my phone without replying. The continued prioritization of Blake's comfort over justice confirmed that Dad still didn't grasp the severity of what had been done, or the non-negotiable nature of what needed to happen to repair it. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by dreams of returning home to find every trace of my existence systematically erased. In one particularly vivid nightmare, I walked through our house calling for Dad, only to have Sandra appear in every room explaining why my presence was no longer convenient or necessary. Morning brought clarity and resolve. I had spent years believing that family loyalty required accepting mistreatment for the sake of harmony. Military service had taught me that true loyalty meant standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult or costly. I spent the morning researching my legal rights regarding personal property and exploring options for temporary housing if the situation at home remained unacceptable. I also reached out to my military family readiness group, connecting with other service members who had faced challenges with civilian-family relationships during deployment. The conversations with fellow service members provided valuable perspective. Several had dealt with similar betrayals of trust during their absence, ranging from financial exploitation to relationship infidelity. The common thread was that military service sometimes revealed the true character of people who had previously hidden their selfishness behind facades of love and support. One conversation particularly resonated. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez had returned from a year-long deployment to find that her civilian boyfriend had moved another woman into their shared apartment and disposed of her personal belongings. When she confronted him, he claimed that her deployment had created uncertainty about their relationship status and that he had made practical decisions to move on with his life. The thing that hurt most, Maria told me during our phone conversation, wasn't losing him. It was realizing that he had never really respected me or our relationship enough to maintain basic decency during my absence. The betrayal revealed who he really was, not who I had believed him to be. Her words captured exactly what I was experiencing with my family. The bedroom situation was devastating, but the deeper wound was the revelation that Dad had been willing to trade away my dignity and security for Sandra's approval and Blake's convenience. At 1:30 p.m., I drove back to the house I had once considered my sanctuary. The familiar neighborhood streets felt different now, like visiting a place where I had once lived but no longer belonged. I parked in the driveway behind Dad's truck, noting that Blake's car was absent. Whether his absence was coincidental or strategic remained to be seen. Dad answered the door before I could knock, his expression haggard but determined. "Riley, I'm glad you came back. We've been talking all morning about solutions." The word solutions was interesting. Not apologies or corrections or restorations, but solutions that suggested the problem was my reaction, rather than their actions. Sandra appeared in the hallway behind Dad, looking composed but wary. "We've come up with some ideas that we think could work for everyone," she said with forced brightness. I followed them into the living room, where I noticed they had arranged themselves on the sofa in a united front while leaving me to take the single chair facing them. The positioning was subtle but clear. This was them versus me, not a family working together to address wrongdoing. "Where's Blake?" I asked. "He's at football practice," Dad replied. We thought it would be better to have this conversation without him here initially. The decision to exclude Blake from a conversation about resolving a situation he was central to revealed another layer of manipulation. They wanted to present me with a fait accompli that Blake could then simply accept without having to engage with the ethical dimensions of his participation. "What are your ideas?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Sandra leaned forward with the enthusiasm of someone about to present a brilliant compromise. "We've researched basement renovations, and there are some amazing possibilities. We could install proper windows, put in luxury vinyl flooring, and create a really sophisticated space that would be much more adult-oriented than a traditional bedroom." The suggestion that a renovated basement would be superior to my original bedroom was so transparently manipulative that I almost laughed. They were trying to reframe my displacement as an upgrade while expecting me to be grateful for their creative problem-solving. "We're prepared to invest several $1,000s in making it really special," Dad added. "Professional design, high-end finishes, maybe even a separate entrance for privacy." The offer to spend money on my consolation prize revealed how completely they misunderstood the situation. This wasn't about accommodations or amenities. It was about respect, dignity, and basic fairness. No amount of renovation could address the fundamental injustice of being displaced from my rightful place in the family. "Sandra," I said calmly, "would you accept a renovated basement bedroom if someone gave away your room to Blake?" Her smile faltered slightly. "That's different. Blake is a teenager with specific needs, and you're an adult building an independent life. I'm a 22-year-old military service member who grew up in this house and has every right to maintain my place here." I corrected. "Blake is a 17-year-old who had his own room before deciding he preferred mine." Dad shifted uncomfortably. "Riley, we're trying to find a path forward that acknowledges everyone's needs. Blake's therapy has been going really well since he moved into the larger room, and his grades have improved significantly." The continued emphasis on Blake's therapeutic progress as justification for maintaining my displacement was revealing. They had convinced themselves that reversing their wrongdoing would be harmful to Blake, which allowed them to frame their refusal to do the right thing as protecting his well-being. "Dad," I said, "have you considered that displacing a military service member might have negative effects on her well-being and therapy needs?" The question clearly hadn't occurred to him. "Are you having psychological problems? Because we can get you help if you need it." "I'm having family problems," I replied. "I'm having trust and respect problems. I'm having problems with the people who should protect my place in this family instead choosing to trade it away for someone else's comfort. Sandra's expression became defensive. We never intended to hurt you. We were managing a complex situation with limited options and trying to do what was best for the family as a whole. Whose definition of best for the family did you use? I asked, because it clearly didn't include input from me. You were focused on your military training, Dad said. We didn't want to burden you with family logistics during such an important time. The paternalistic assumption that I couldn't handle family discussions while managing military training was insulting to both my intelligence and my capability. It also conveniently ignored the fact that major decisions affecting my life should include my perspective regardless of my current circumstances. Did you discuss this decision with anyone outside the family? I asked. Sandra and Dad exchanged glances. We consulted with Dr. Martinez about Blake's therapeutic needs. Sandra replied carefully. Did Dr. Martinez specifically recommend taking my bedroom away from me? He recommended that Blake have a stable, comfortable personal space to support his emotional development, Sandra said. Blake already had a stable, comfortable personal space, I pointed out. His own bedroom. Did Dr. Martinez know that his recommendation would be implemented by displacing a military service member? The evasive looks between Sandra and Dad told me that Dr. Martinez had probably been given incomplete information about the family dynamics and the specific implementation of his general recommendations. I want to speak with Dr. Martinez directly, I said. That's not appropriate, Sandra replied quickly. He's Blake's therapist, and confidentiality rules apply. I'm not asking for details about Blake's therapy. I'm asking whether he was informed that his recommendations would be implemented through the displacement of another family member, and whether he endorsed that specific approach. The panic in Sandra's eyes suggested that Dr. Martinez had not been given full context about how his therapeutic recommendations were being used to justify my displacement. Dad cleared his throat. Riley, we're trying to move forward constructively. What would it take for you to accept the basement arrangement? What would make it work for you? The question revealed that he still viewed this as a negotiation rather than a correction of wrongdoing. He was looking for my price for accepting injustice, rather than acknowledging that justice didn't have a price. Dad, I said quietly, there is no arrangement that makes displacing me from my childhood bedroom acceptable. This isn't about accommodations or amenities. This is about respect and basic fairness. But Blake is settled now, Sandra interjected. His equipment is installed, his routine is established, and his progress would be disrupted by major changes. My life was disrupted by major changes, I replied. But that didn't prevent you from making those changes when they benefited Blake. That's different, she insisted. How is it different? Blake is still a minor living at home full-time. You're an adult with military housing options and an independent career path. The suggestion that military service somehow disqualified me from maintaining a place in my childhood home was breathtakingly callous. My willingness to serve my country was being used as evidence that I deserved less consideration and respect than someone who had never made comparable sacrifices. Sandra, I said, Blake chose to accept benefits that came at my expense. That was his decision, and he can live with the consequences of that decision being reversed. It wasn't his decision, Dad protested. It was our decision as the adults in the family. Then, as the adults in the family, you can make the decision to correct your mistake. The silence that followed made it clear they had no intention of correcting anything. They had hoped to manage my reaction through offers of compensatory accommodations, but they weren't prepared to address the fundamental injustice of the situation. What if Blake doesn't want to move back to his original room? Sandra asked. Then Blake will have to learn that getting what we want sometimes requires accepting what's right and fair, I replied. Dad's face reddened. Riley, you're being unreasonable. We're offering you solutions, and you're rejecting everything without consideration. I'm rejecting Band-Aids for a problem that requires surgery, I corrected. You can't fix a fundamental betrayal of trust with renovations and amenities. Sandra leaned back on the sofa, her facade of reasonableness cracking. So what exactly are you demanding? That we uproot Blake's entire life to satisfy your ego? The accusation that wanting justice was about ego revealed how completely she had misframed the situation in her own mind. She genuinely believed that my displacement was reasonable and that my objection was petty selfishness. "I'm demanding that my family acknowledge wrongdoing and take concrete action to correct it," I said. "That's not ego. That's basic human dignity." "And if we don't?" Dad asked, his voice taking on an edge I had never heard before. The question hung in the air like a challenge. He was asking me to reveal my bottom line, my consequences for their continued refusal to address the injustice they had created. "Then I'll have to acknowledge that this family no longer exists in any form I can be part of," I replied quietly. Dad's expression became angry and defensive. "So you're threatening to cut us off because you didn't get your way?" The characterization of justice as getting my way revealed how fundamentally he had misunderstood the situation. This wasn't about preferences or desires. It was about respect and basic fairness. "I'm not threatening anything," I said. "I'm stating facts. A family that displaces one member for the convenience of others isn't a family I can belong to. A father who trades away his daughter's dignity for his stepson's comfort isn't a father I can respect." The words hit Dad like physical blows, and I could see genuine pain in his expression. But the pain was mixed with anger and defensiveness that told me he was more hurt by my honesty than motivated to change his behavior. "Riley," Sandra said coldly, "if you can't accept that families sometimes require sacrifice and compromise, then maybe you're right that this isn't the family for you." Her willingness to call my bluff revealed that she had never viewed me as an equal member of this family. I was an obstacle to her vision of family life that could be managed, accommodated, or ultimately discarded if I became too difficult. "The only person in this family who has been required to sacrifice is me," I replied. "Blake has been required to accept benefits. You've been required to facilitate those benefits. Dad has been required to enable your decisions. I'm the only one who has been asked to give up anything." Dad stood up abruptly, his composure finally cracking. "You know what, Riley? Maybe you should move out permanently. Maybe Blake was right when he said you were always difficult and demanding." The revelation that Blake had been characterizing me as difficult and demanding during my absence was another piece of the puzzle. He hadn't just passively accepted the benefits of my displacement. He had actively participated in justifying it by portraying me as someone whose needs didn't deserve consideration. "When did Blake say that?" I asked. Dad's face flushed as he realized he had revealed more than he intended. "It doesn't matter when. The point is that you've never been satisfied with anything, and now you're trying to destroy this family because you didn't get exactly what you wanted." The complete rewriting of our family history was stunning. The daughter who had worked multiple jobs to help with expenses, who had maintained excellent grades, who had never been in trouble with drugs or alcohol, who had chosen military service partly to honor his values, was now being characterized as perpetually difficult and demanding. "Dad," I said, standing to face him directly, "look me in the eye and tell me honestly whether you believe that description of me is accurate or fair." For a moment, his expression flickered with uncertainty and what might have been shame. But Sandra's hand on his arm seemed to reinforce his resolve. "I believe that you're being selfish and unreasonable right now," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. The moment crystallized everything I needed to understand about the situation. Dad knew that what they had done was wrong, but he was more committed to protecting his marriage than to protecting his relationship with me. Sandra had successfully positioned this as a choice between supporting her family unit or capitulating to my demands. "I understand," I said quietly. "You've made your choice." I moved toward the hallway, heading for the stairs to retrieve whatever personal items I could carry from the boxes in the basement. Behind me, I heard Sandra whisper urgently to Dad, but I couldn't make out the words. In the basement, I gathered my military documents, a few pieces of jewelry that had belonged to my mother, and some photographs that couldn't be replaced. Everything else could remain in storage or be disposed of according to their preferences. I was done fighting for scraps of dignity in a home where I was no longer welcome as an equal member. As I climbed the stairs with my small collection of irreplaceable items, I found Dad waiting at the top with an expression of genuine anguish. "Riley, please don't do this. We can work something out." "Dad," I said gently, "you've already worked something out. You worked out a family arrangement that doesn't include me as an equal member. I'm simply acknowledging that reality. You're my daughter, he said, his voice breaking slightly. Yes, I agreed. And Blake is your stepson. And Sandra is your wife. And somehow, in your mind, those relationships became more important than treating me with basic respect and fairness. His face crumpled as the full weight of what he had prioritized became clear. It wasn't supposed to be a choice between you and them. It became a choice the moment you decided my displacement was acceptable for their benefit, I replied. And you made that choice without including me in the decision. Sandra appeared behind Dad, her expression cold and determined. Riley, if you're determined to be dramatic and leave, then perhaps that's for the best. Blake and your father deserve to live without constant conflict and criticism. The final manipulation was masterful in its cruelty. She was reframing my departure as abandonment, while positioning herself as the protector of Dad and Blake from my allegedly toxic presence. Sandra, I said, you got exactly what you wanted. Blake has my room. Dad prioritizes your preferences over my dignity, and I'm removing myself as an obstacle to your vision of family life. You should be celebrating. Her mask slipped slightly, revealing satisfaction that she quickly tried to hide behind concern. We never wanted you to leave. We wanted you to be part of this family. No, I corrected. You wanted me to accept a diminished role in this family. There's a significant difference. Dad made one final attempt to prevent the inevitable. Riley, what if we compromise? Blake keeps the room during the school year, but it becomes yours again during your leaves? The suggestion that I should become a seasonal occupant of my own childhood bedroom was so absurd that I almost laughed. He was offering to let me visit my own room like a guest in a hotel. Dad, I said, Blake will graduate high school and leave for college in less than 2 years. Are you suggesting I should wait until then to have my place in this family restored? We could make the basement really nice, he said desperately. I know you could, I agreed, but I'm not willing to accept basement accommodations in my own childhood home while someone else enjoys the space I grew up in. As I moved toward the front door, Sandra delivered her final blow. Blake was right about you being selfish. You'd rather destroy this family than share space with your brother. Blake isn't my brother, I replied calmly. Brothers don't displace each other for personal convenience. Blake is a teenage boy who accepted benefits that came at my expense, and then criticized me for objecting to the arrangement. The front door felt heavier than usual as I opened it, weighted with the finality of what was ending. Behind me, I could hear Dad pleading for more time to work things out, but his voice sounded distant and hollow. Dad, I said, without turning around, when you're ready to acknowledge that what you did was wrong and when you're prepared to take concrete action to fix it, you have my number. Until then, there's nothing more to discuss. I closed the door behind me and walked to my car without looking back. The house where I had been born, where I had taken my first steps, where my mother had read me bedtime stories, where Dad had taught me to ride a bike, was no longer my home. It had become Sandra and Blake's domain, with Dad as an accessory to their comfort. The drive away from my childhood neighborhood felt like emerging from a fog of denial and false hope. I had spent years making excuses for Sandra's favoritism toward Blake and Dad's increasing willingness to prioritize their comfort over my dignity. I had convinced myself that military service would somehow reset our family dynamics and restore the relationship Dad and I had enjoyed before Sandra's influence changed everything. But this betrayal had revealed the truth. Dad had fundamentally shifted his loyalties and priorities. He was no longer the man who had raised me with love and respect. He had become someone who could rationalize trading away his daughter's dignity for his wife's approval and his stepson's convenience. My phone buzzed with text messages as I drove toward the hotel, but I didn't check them. Whatever Dad or Sandra wanted to say at this point was irrelevant. They had made their choice clear through actions that spoke louder than any words could. At the hotel, I sat on the bed with my laptop and began researching permanent housing options in the area. My military benefits provided resources for finding appropriate accommodations, and my service record would help with employment opportunities if I decided to transition to civilian work. For the first time since returning home, I felt something approaching peace. The anxiety and confusion of trying to navigate a family situation that made no logical sense had been replaced by the clarity of understanding that I was on my own. Military training had prepared me for independence and self-reliance. I had skills, benefits, education opportunities, and a support network of fellow service members who understood sacrifice and loyalty. I didn't need a family that viewed my dignity as negotiable. 3 days later, I found a small but comfortable apartment near the base where I would be stationed after completing my advanced training. The space was mine alone, free from manipulation and compromise and degradation disguised as family harmony. I sent a brief text to Dad with my new address and a simple message. I hope Blake enjoys the room. When you're ready to acknowledge what you sacrificed to give it to him, you know how to reach me. His response came hours later. Riley, please don't let this destroy our relationship. You're my daughter and I love you. I typed back, Dad, you destroyed our relationship when you chose to prioritize Blake's comfort over my dignity. I'm simply acknowledging that reality. The door remains open if you ever want to repair what you broke, but that requires admitting wrongdoing and taking action to fix it. There was no response to that message. 6 months later, I received a graduation announcement for Blake's high school commencement. Inside was a handwritten note from Dad. Blake got a football scholarship to state. The extra space for his equipment really helped his training. We're very proud. Hope you're doing well. The message revealed everything I needed to know about whether Dad had gained any understanding of the situation. Blake's success was being used as retroactive justification for my displacement, as if good outcomes for him somehow validated the injustice done to me. I did not respond to the graduation announcement. 1 year after that, Sandra sent a wedding invitation for Blake's marriage to his high school girlfriend. The return address was still my childhood home, confirming that Blake had continued living in my room throughout his college years. I returned the invitation without opening it. 2 years later, Dad called me, directly for the first time since our confrontation. His voice sounded older and more fragile than I remembered. Riley, I wanted you to know that Sandra and I are getting divorced. Blake moved out permanently, and the house feels empty. I've been thinking about a lot of things, and I want to talk. The call was both surprising and predictable. Sandra's mission of securing Blake's advantages had been accomplished, and with Blake launched into independent adulthood, she no longer needed Dad as a facilitator for her son's benefits. What would you like to talk about? I asked. I think I might have made some mistakes, he said carefully, with how we handled the room situation and other family decisions. The tentative acknowledgement was encouraging but insufficient. Some mistakes was a significant understatement of a systematic betrayal that had destroyed our relationship. Dad, I said, I'm willing to listen if you're prepared to have an honest conversation about what happened and take responsibility for your choices. Could we meet for coffee? He asked. Not yet, I replied. I need to hear you acknowledge specifically what you did wrong before I'm willing to spend time working on repair. The silence stretched for several seconds. I prioritized keeping peace in my marriage over protecting your place in our family, he said finally. I let Sandra convince me that displacing you was reasonable because you were building an independent life through military service. I should have stood up for you. The acknowledgement was more complete than I had expected, but it was only the beginning of what would be required to rebuild trust. What else? I asked. I should have discussed the decision with you before making changes to your room. I should have recognized that what we were doing was wrong. I should have prioritized your dignity and security over Blake's convenience. The admission was painful to hear but necessary for any possibility of repair. And what would you do differently if faced with a similar situation now? I asked. I would never make major decisions affecting your life without including you in the process. I would never trade away your place in our family for someone else's comfort. I would protect our relationship even if it created conflict with Sandra. The conversation was the beginning of a very slow process of rebuilding trust that took years to accomplish. Dad and I eventually developed a new relationship based on mutual respect and clear boundaries, but it was fundamentally different from the unconditional trust I had once felt. Blake never apologized for accepting benefits that came at my expense, and I never forgot the ease with which he had displaced me and then criticized me for objecting. When Dad and I reconciled, Blake's presence remained a barrier to full family reunification. Sandra's influence had ultimately destroyed the family she claimed to be protecting. Her prioritization of Blake's advantages over everyone else's dignity had created irreparable divisions that outlasted her marriage to Dad. The room that had been so important to Blake's therapeutic development became just another empty bedroom after he moved out permanently. Dad offered to restore it as my space during one of our reconciliation conversations, but by then I had built a life that didn't require validation through childhood accommodations. Military service had taught me that respect and dignity weren't negotiable, even within family relationships. The betrayal that had initially seemed devastating had ultimately freed me from accepting diminished treatment for the sake of false harmony. Some family bonds survive any test, while others reveal their fragility when exposed to real pressure. The difference lies not in the strength of blood relationships, but in the character of the people who choose to honor or abandon the responsibilities that come with love. My father learned that lesson at the cost of years of separation from his daughter. Blake learned it when his mother's marriage collapsed after achieving her goals for his advancement. Sandra learned it when her manipulative strategies ultimately left her isolated from the family she had claimed to be protecting. The military family I built through service proved more loyal and supportive than the biological family that had traded away my dignity for temporary convenience. True family, I discovered, is defined not by shared genetics but by shared commitment to protecting each other's well-being and respecting each other's worth. The pink dress with hidden messages had been a weapon disguised as a gift, but my family's betrayal had been the opposite, a genuine wound disguised as practical necessity. Both had taught essential lessons about recognizing manipulation and refusing to accept unacceptable treatment, regardless of its source. In the end, standing up for my dignity had cost me a family relationship that had already been fundamentally damaged by betrayal. But it had also taught me that some prices are too high to pay for belonging, and that self-respect is worth more than acceptance that requires diminishing yourself. The room may have been just a room, but the principles it represented were the foundation of everything that mattered: respect, dignity, fairness, and the courage to defend those values even when the cost seemed unbearable. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.